How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hi, you're listening to DNA Today, a podcast and radio show where we discover new advances in the world of genetics. From genetic technology like CRISPR to rare diseases to new research, we have you covered. For a decade, DNA Today has brought you the voices of leaders in genetics. I'm Dineen. I'm a certified genetic counselor and your host. The Big Biology podcast dives deep on some of the most provocative and exciting topics in biology today in a fun and accessible way. In each episode, hosts Art Woods and Marty Martin, biology professors themselves, talk to leading scientists and journalists from around the world about the biggest, most cutting-edge topics in biology. From human consciousness, human origins, new directions in evolutionary theory, to the emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 and much more. Whether you're a researcher, teacher, student, or simply curious about science and biology, you'll love the entertaining and deep conversations about biology and the exposures to the research they bring. Learn more at bigbiology.org and subscribe, rate, and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me now is Dr. Kourtney Salari. She is the Chief Medical Officer at Mitera. Mitera has at-home reproductive genetic testing, including non-invasive prenatal screening and carrier screening, which we're going to dive into. And this is an area that I'm very passionate about and talking about every day as a prenatal genetic counselor. But thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Kira.
So I wanted to start by talking about the inspiration for starting Mitera. And is there like a reason for the name?
I'll answer the second question first. So Mitera actually is the Greek word for mother. So when we were looking for names, we were looking for something that we thought was suitable. And really, since mother is really central to what I've spent my career and dedicated to, it seemed like an appropriate name for the company. In terms of inspiration and kind of the backstory behind the company, I'm a maternal-fetal medicine physician by background, so have spent several years in training, really trying to identify risk in pregnancy and risk stratification and appropriate management of pregnancy to better outcomes. Have spent several years just in sort of a brick and mortar clinical practice where I oversaw a large ultrasound unit, have largely dedicated my focus to the detection of prenatal disease. So whether that's birth defects or genetic diseases, and counseling patients and guiding through them in these sort of difficult situations. So my experience in that world really showed me that as technology has advanced, there's a lot more that women and reproductive couples can find out prior to pregnancy or even during their pregnancy, but it's very confusing. And prenatal care is really filled with a lot of different aspects of caring for the pregnant individual. And a lot of times the genetic counseling piece and the options that you have somewhat, I think, doesn't get the appropriate time and attention that it really deserves. And I think it leaves women and reproductive couples not fully understanding what is at their disposal in terms of testing. So what I found just in my normal day-to-day is that I would have a patient come in and I would ask whether they did a certain type of screening modality or testing modality in pregnancy, and 9 times out of 10, the patient didn't know, even when they had actually ordered the test. And, I think a lot of times patients don't recognize that because maybe the results were low risk and they didn't have anything to worry about. But it was somewhat of an unsettling feeling for me as a clinician that so many tests were being potentially ordered or not ordered, and the patient was really unaware of what the situation was.
I can totally agree with that, of just, the short time that I've been a practicing genetic counselor, of patients that I meet with that we're going over this test. They're like, first off, I had no idea it was even ordered. It's just like, oh, I drew a bunch of blood. I don't know exactly what it was all for. And that, to me, I'm like, oh, we need informed consent, which we're gonna talk about and everything. But I think that's something that we see so often, that either a test is ordered without a patient's consent, or a test wasn't offered to a patient. So definitely, I really agree with you on that, of just looking at being in the clinic right now, of seeing that.
Right. And I think that most of us in this field, including, most of the genetic counselors that I work with, would agree that that I think there's a lot of work to be done to sharing information in this space, so that individuals can make decisions that are right for them. So sometimes it's not always ordering the test. Sometimes it means not ordering a test. But I think the first step is really information sharing.
Yeah, I think that's key. And also something that you said was, if a patient doesn't want a test, so they can learn about a test and say, thank you for going through this. I don't want the test. I'm like, I'm so glad we talked about it. We didn't just order it for you. I think that's a really important aspect there. And one of the tests that we're going to talk about is carrier screening. So for carrier screening, I feel like I'm a broken record in interviews saying this can be performed on people before they're pregnant. So what types of conditions are screened for in carrier screening? When someone asks, like, okay, well, what is carrier screening? Like, what conditions are going to be looked at? What's like your elevator pitch for them of like, okay, this is what carrier screening is?
So, I'll start by also emphasizing that, yes, it can be done before pregnancy. And in fact, it's actually ideal for it to be done before pregnancy, because it allows a lot more time for individuals to process results and make decisions about what they want to do. So carrier screening is really aimed at looking at inherited conditions that a reproductive couple could pass down to a future child. And our panel is quite large. So it is an expanded carrier panel of about 420 conditions. The vast majority of these conditions are inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion. So that means that both biologic mother and biologic father would have to carry a mutation in order to have a child with this condition. There are about 32 conditions on our panel that are actually X-linked. So that means a woman who has a mutation in one of these genes has a 50% chance of having a child with this condition. And I would say the vast majority of panels that you see out there are usually incorporate autosomal recessive conditions.
Yeah, usually that's the largest number. And then the X-linked is, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and Fragile X is usually like the top two X-linked conditions on there. And I had an experience of going through the carrier screening for this. And you guys call it the 23 pairs test. That's your brand name for it. So, almost like this isn't quite a counseling session, but I did come back as a carrier for one condition. So out of the 400 plus conditions that were screened for, those were all negative, or what we consider to be low risk, because it is screening. But I came back as a carrier for one condition. Can you share a little bit about congenital myasthenia syndrome, and if I pronounce that right?
Yes. So, so you came back a carrier for congenital myasthenia syndrome. I would classify this condition as a diverse group of conditions that can be caused by mutations in different genes. And broadly speaking, it's essentially a miscommunication between nerve cells and the muscle cells they innervate. So nerve cells, generally, in order for you to, let's say, lift your arm voluntarily or blink your eyes or open your mouth, the nerve cell has to release neurotransmitters, which are sort of the chemical messengers. And they release that into this area called the synaptic space. And those little messengers go and attach to receptors that are on the surface, or what we call the postsynaptic membrane of the muscle cell. And when there are mutations in genes involved in any part of this process, it can lead to essentially a miscommunication of that nerve and muscle, such that the manifesting symptoms can be fatigue or weakness with use. And certainly there's a spectrum of severity in that condition. So children who are born, or babies that are born with congenital forms of myasthenia gravis, tend to have a more severe manifestation where there might be significant weakness or even contractions of the muscle because there is very little communication between the nerves and muscles. Now, fortunately, and this is part of our counseling when it comes to autosomal recessive diseases, is that there really is no health implication for you to being a carrier.
That was the first thing I looked at. Like, is there any implications? And in most of the cases, it's no, but there are cases like DMD carriers that I mentioned, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, like they could have issues of being a carrier.
Correct.
So yes, that is the first thing that I looked at. I'm like, okay, there aren't any. So I'm like, okay, sigh of relief. Like, that's the biggest thing for me since I'm not currently pregnant. Yep.
Correct. So, we start with the good news first. So we say, you know what, good news is that you're healthy and this has no implications on your future health. But where this would be of concern is if you were planning a pregnancy in the future, and if, bad luck were to happen that your reproductive partner were to also be a similar carrier as yourself, then you would have a 1 in 4 or 25% chance of having a child with that condition. So the ability, and sometimes we have patients who will do this before they're even planning, or even they have a reproductive partner, but they will always know in the back of their mind that, okay, when I'm planning my pregnancy, I should have my reproductive partner tested.
Which is exactly my situation, right? So I don't have a certain partner or sperm donor that I'm eyeing at the moment or anything, not trying to get pregnant anytime soon. But I know when that time does come that, okay, let me make sure that the sperm donor or, my partner is looked at for this condition specifically. But without knowing my partner's carrier status right now, my risk is 1 in 10,000 of having a child with this condition. So that's an extremely low chance. Right. It's only that 25% chance if that person's identified as a carrier, which is a huge difference. A lot of people, when I'm giving carrier screening results, are nervous. They're hearing about this very serious condition, just like in this case, but okay, let's talk about that 1 in 10,000 risk. That's very low. So not something that I'm concerned about, especially at this point in my life. So I really like how you've explained that, and that a lot of these conditions are spectrum disorders, just like this one, where some forms of it are more severe and some are more mild, which I think we're learning in general in genetics is the case for, I don't know if I want to say most conditions, but a lot of conditions. Yes, right. Many, especially, these 400 plus, a lot of them apply to that. If you enjoyed DNA Today, especially episode 139 with Dani Shapiro, who discovered she was donor conceived, then you'll also enjoy more shocking discoveries from DNA testing and a new podcast I love, Biohacked Family Secrets. It's a brand new podcast all about hidden ancestry, medicine, and technology. The show follows the children of anonymous sperm and egg donors, some with dozens or even hundreds of half-siblings, who accidentally learn the truth because of commercial DNA tests like 23andMe. The podcast drops some bombshells and shows how new technology is unraveling the deep, dark secrets of the baby business. Along with scandalous personal stories, Biohacked Family Secrets also reveals unexpected ethical, scientific, and political questions. It's a vital listen for anyone who loves wild stories about science, tech, and history, or even just messy family drama. You can find Biohacked Family Secrets wherever you're listening right now. New episodes drop every Wednesday. So what's the process, and I can kind of share my own experience with doing this carrier screening of, as we talked about at the beginning, of getting informed consent before doing the testing, so that people, if they got this result, don't think, oh, they have this condition, or if they're currently pregnant, the pregnancy is affected by the condition. What's your company policy and just where you stand in terms of offering that informed consent?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And so when we first started talking, I mentioned sort of what inspired us to start the company. And it was really about broadening access to certain technologies in pregnancy. But the underpinning of that is informed decision making, right? So technology in a vacuum can actually be quite harmful if you don't know what you're getting into or what it means. It can cause undue anxiety. And so even though we wanted to provide broad access to many of the reproductive genetic tests that are out there, we felt very strongly about having very standardized information regarding what these tests were, what they could tell you, what they could not tell you, as well as, how to help patients when they receive results and what the next steps are. So it is a very simple ordering process for patients. They come to our website. If one of the genetic tests looks appealing to them, they can click on it. They have the option of sort of the payment process, whether it's insurance or self-pay. There is a clinical intake portion. So that clinical intake asks relevant questions about medical history, family history, genetic history. But the most important part of that intake is really the standardized information sharing that occurs after that. So all patients have access to a reproductive genetic counselor if they choose to do that as a genetic counseling session. Certainly, I think we all know that many folks are busy and would perhaps like something at 10 o'clock in their pajamas. And so they might rather choose our sort of our education module that they go through instead. That education module is several minutes long and goes through modes of inheritance. What does it mean to be born with an inherited condition? What does it mean to be a carrier? What could you do with this information? So it's all the pre-test counseling points that we think are important to share with patients before they embark on this test. After that is all done, patients are asked okay, now that you've heard about it and we've educated you about it, do you still want to do the test? So, and if a patient says yes, then that takes them through the consent form. And the consent form largely outlines things that were already mentioned in the education module, but the patient signs and says, yes, I understand what this is, and I watched that video and I get it. And then after that, the order gets processed.
Yeah, and I found the video to be very helpful. And it's like, as I was listening and watching the video, like, okay, yes, I cover that during pretest counseling. Like, all really the major points that I cover with the patient were covered in the video. And I'm like, this ain't, in some ways, maybe it's even more engaging than watching me talk about these things because it's a video, things are moving, So I think it's a great way. And I think another tool in the genetic counseling tool belt to be able to use, because we don't have enough genetic counselors and MFMs like yourself that are in this space, that are educated about carrier screening and the other tests that we'll talk about, to really be able to explain all this. So I think a video captures the pre-test side, just as well as I think, in person does. I think, covering all the points, and it was very easy to go through. And I was even surprised. I was asked, like, do you have an OBGYN or another medical provider you'd like results to be sent to? And,
yes.
I clicked no, but, I can see that being very helpful. Like, oh yes, please send this over because I am pregnant and I want to do this earlier. And I know who's going to be delivering me, or like whatever the case is. So I found that to be really helpful. But yeah, it's just great that you're able to provide all of this in such a streamlined fashion. One question I did have around this is, let's say I was pregnant and my partner ended up getting tested and was a carrier of the same condition. Mm-hmm. In that case, do you have recommendations for what patients do at that point? Because if I was in person and the counselor for that patient, I would say, okay, let's talk about the next step of testing if that's something you want to do. So invasive testing like an amniocentesis or CVS. What's the workflow at that point?
So all of the results that get processed through Mitera are first evaluated by our clinical staff. And then we determine, are these results going to be sent to the patient or released to the patient? Like in your case, you were a simple carrier, doesn't really have implications for you. You don't have a reproductive partner that also tested positive. But the example that you bring up where you have a positive carrier couple, has important implications, and results are not actually released at that time. So patients are contacted to schedule a visit with a genetic counselor to talk about all those options. So we sort of transition from kind of a very virtual hands-off approach to basically what you might experience if you were in an office where you have a sit down, a genetic counselor talks to you about what this means, goes over the statistics, and talks about CVS and amniocentesis. And what are the diagnostic tests that you could do during your pregnancy to confirm whether or not your future child could be affected by this condition. For patients that, and many do potentially, if they find out they're a positive carrier couple during a pregnancy, if they want to test the pregnancy, then we contact one of the many maternal-fetal medicine offices in our directory and find an office that is close in location to the patient, so that we are essentially handing the baton off to the brick and mortar office so that there is no misstep, there is no, nothing falls through the cracks in the clinical care of this patient. So that's a lot of where we put our emphasis and our manpower behind, is really engaging and hand-holding when it matters most for patients.
Yeah, I think that's very important. In my case, I got a notification, okay, your results are ready, and I could view them, download the PDF. But it sounds like, you know, in the case of where it's more of a at-risk situation, that's when you would have a genetic counselor be the one informing the person.
Correct.
So that's a really great aspect, because I think if someone just received that as a PDF, that would, I don't know, I would not be a fan of that. You know, I have to be honest. It's nice that you have this workflow that certain things can be automated and certain things just can't. And I don't think they ever should be. So I think that's a really good approach to it, and great that you're able to refer out to providers in their local area, because tests are available in all 50 states of the US. So, you know, you're covering a lot of ground with that.
Yes.
Yeah, so definitely great that that's part of it, because that really is part of the counseling process. And that if a couple is identified as that they're a carrier of the same condition, there's also options before pregnancy. So like IVF options, and I'm sure you guys go through that.
Yes,
everything.
we do. Absolutely.
So to switch gears to the other task, the one I didn't do, what information is included in the non-invasive prenatal screening? So this is what you guys call the Peaches&Me test. What information can someone glean from this?
So this is a cell-free DNA screening modality, also known as non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT. And our test screens for trisomy 21, also known as Down syndrome, trisomy 18, trisomy 13, and sex chromosome abnormalities like monosomy X, also known as Turner syndrome. So our NIPT is very much limited to the most common chromosomal abnormalities that one would encounter during a pregnancy.
So what was the decision behind not including microdeletions on the panel? Because that's something that I noticed that some providers, some laboratories offer looking at what's called microdeletion. So instead of a whole chromosome extra missing, it's a tiny piece of a chromosome missing that goes with a specific condition. What were part of the conversations that led to that decision?
So yes, a very poignant question given the controversies around microdeletion screening these days.
Yes.
So, you know, I think the fundamental reason why we left microdeletions out is the issues surrounding detection rates and false positives on microdeletion screening. It's not to say that a woman or a pregnant couple should not be or would not be concerned about a baby that could have a microdeletional syndrome. But I think that as a screening modality, especially with cell-free DNA, it is fraught with a lot of false positives. And particularly when you are trying to use a virtual platform to make screening modalities largely available and streamline it and make it very efficient, I think you have to be very careful to not overstep, and particularly when it's not a face-to-face provider, and you might cause undue anxiety with a lot of false positives. It was largely a medical decision we made to leave that off. Again, I do think that there is a role for microdeletional screening. I think that's a little bit more of a broader conversation of, well, if I'm very concerned about microdeletions, maybe I'm somebody who wants to do an amniocentesis. Maybe that's actually the test that is more suited for me rather than NIPT. I think because NIPT is very powerful for the detection of Down syndrome, I think there is a natural tendency to assume its performance is similar for microdeletions. Which it's not. And so I think it is, again, fine to do, it's not to say that one should never do a screening modality for a microdeletion with an NIPT technology, but you have to be very careful that the patient understands what its limitations are. So I think in my mind, there was too much area for confusion between microdeletions and common aneuploidies and the performance difference that we decided not to include them.
And they are fairly rare conditions. The most common on that list affects 1 in 2,000 babies for DiGeorge syndrome. So in general, when you're comparing it to Down syndrome, that's, 1 in a couple hundred, depending on how old the patient is at delivery. It's just kind of different numbers there. So I certainly understand the decision there. And, in January of 2022, there was the New York Times article, which I'm sure you read.
Yes, we did.
Yes. But, I have patients still asking about it. That, I think I have some issues with the article, to be frank, but, there were some good points in there, but some areas where I'm like, you should have done a little more research, or just the way they phrase things was not, necessarily the best. But yeah, it's certainly something that, that's one difference that, providers, like someone may order microdeletion as a healthcare provider for a patient, but not necessarily. Some people are ordering exactly the same conditions that are ordered for this test. So as we're talking about, false positives for the microdeletions, how about for the conditions that Peaches&Me screens for? So the trisomies 13, 18, 21, and the sex chromosomes. Do you have any kind of ranges of numbers in terms of false positives, false negatives?
So, I would say that the detection rate, the sensitivities and specificities for our common aneuploidies are pretty much on par with what you see with many of the NIPT technologies that are out there. For Down syndrome, our sensitivity is around 99.7%. I think the positive predictive value is about 95%. So, positive predictive value is essentially the likelihood that your positive result is an actual true positive. So it's really the number most patients care about. And when we look at trisomy 18, I think it's about in the high 80s, low 90s. Trisomy 13, which many NIPT technologies have struggled a little bit more just due to the characteristics of that chromosome, is closer to probably 70 or 65 to 70% in terms of its positive predictive value. So
very similar numbers in terms of what a healthcare provider orders in general.
Correct. Yeah.
So not only can patients directly order this themselves, like as I guess not even really a patient in that situation, but a client more, or customer, you've also worked with organizations like hospitals and clinics to be able to help them process testing. I imagine especially places that maybe they don't have a genetic counselor. I can see where this would be very helpful. Along with that, does Mitera accept insurance? Because I think that's gonna, if someone's like, okay, I want to do this testing, that might be like a, possibly a deal breaker for people.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, we absolutely allow insurance billing. In fact, patients can do a prior authorization process. So you can tell us, please process through my insurance first. Only if my deductible, sometimes patients don't have plans that are actually very good at coverage. And so we do have a cash pay sort of pre-negotiated price that is relatively reasonable within the genetic testing world. And so patients can decide, please bill my insurance. If my insurance rejects this or my deductible is actually higher than your cash price, please just bill me the cash price. So there are sort of both options there to make it more flexible for patients. In regards to working with organizations, and I'll add, not only is it places that don't have genetic counselors, but even those places that do, because most genetic counselors end up being very overwhelmed by the deluge of just sort of low risk, normal pregnancies coming in, doing options
counseling.
A lot
of my calls.
Yes, yep. It's a lot of patients, and we don't have nearly enough providers to cover the 4 million births in this country a year. So, we view ourselves as very complementary to the office. So we're not here to take patients out of their care paradigm, but to really assist and be complementary to it. And so because there is so much to cover in prenatal care, particularly that first prenatal visit, from taking a whole history and doing an exam and doing an ultrasound, and now that genetic testing and screening has gotten so complex, it really deserves more than 2 minutes. And it's really hard to fit a lot of that into a prenatal visit. And on top of that, you need to have staff dedicated to, okay, I'm going to fill out the requisition, I'm going to follow through with the insurance, I'm going to get the result. So it's an entire workflow that we allow clinics to sort of outsource to us. So, we're not really a testing company. We don't view ourselves as a testing company. We're really a virtual healthcare provider that allows for really easy and efficient access to tests. So in that sense, we work with clinics or hospitals that want to make this widely available for their patients, but they'll feel secure that it's done in a very responsible way and it's overseen medically.
Yes, I think that's so important. And thank you for all this insight. And, it's nice to be able to talk about my own field on the show, because most of the time I'm talking about cancer, pediatrics, ophthalmology, like whatever I am talking about in genetics. So it's nice to, come back home to prenatal sometimes. But thank you so much, Dr. Salari, for just covering all of this and, providing so much great information. We're going to have more information in the show notes. So we're going to include hopefully a link to the video, if there's a link to that, so that people can check that out in terms of like the informed consent and just learning more about the process. And then I'm also going to include the front page of my own genetic testing report, so you guys can see what that looks like. So thank you so much, Dr. Salari, for coming on the show. It's just been a pleasure to talk about this and go through the process myself.
Well, thank you, Kira, for having us. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you. And thanks for, highlighting the important aspects of reproductive genetics.
For more information about today's episode, visit dnapodcast.com, where you can also stream all episodes of the show. We encourage your questions, comments, guest pitches, and ideas. Send them all into info@dnapodcast.com. Search DNA Today on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, so you can connect with us there. And a favor, please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This truly helps us climb the charts and allow more genetic nerds like yourself to find the show. DNA Today is hosted and produced by myself, Dineen. Our social media lead is Corinne Merlino. Our video lead is Amanda Andrioli. Thanks for listening, and join us next time to discover new advances in the world of genetics.
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, they're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.